Hello there, and welcome to the Sleepy History Facts channel. Tonight, we are stepping back to one of the most extraordinary and most enduring stories in the history of the modern world. The Titanic, a ship so vast and so beautiful, and so confident in its own invincibility, that its destruction in the early hours of the 15th of April 1912 sent a shock through the world that has never entirely faded. More than a century has passed since the Titanic went down in the North Atlantic. More books have been written about it than about almost any other single event in modern history. More films, more documentaries, more investigations, more arguments about what happened and who was responsible and what it all means than any ship that ever sailed has generated before or since. And still it draws us back. Because the Titanic is not simply a story about a ship. It is a story about the world that built the ship. A world of extraordinary confidence and extraordinary inequality. A world that believed in progress so completely that it built the largest moving object in human history and sailed it into the North Atlantic in April without enough lifeboats for everyone on board. It is a story about what happens when the things we are most certain of turn out to be wrong. When the ship that cannot sink, sinks. When the age that believes in its own mastery of the natural world is reminded, in the coldest and darkest possible way, that mastery has limits. But it is also, at its heart, a story about people. About the first-class passengers in their staterooms, and the third-class passengers in their shared cabins, about the crew who kept their posts, and the officers who made decisions they would spend the rest of their lives defending, about the band that kept playing, and the wireless operators who stayed at their posts until the last possible moment, about the people in the lifeboats watching the lights go out, and the people still on the ship when they did. This is their story, all of them. If these quiet journeys through history bring you some peace tonight, I would love it if you liked or subscribed or left a thought below. It helps others find their way here too, one sleepy soul at a time. But for now, all you need to do is settle in. Let your body grow heavy. Let your breathing slow. And as the night gathers around you, come with me to Belfast in 1909, where the keel of the greatest ship in the world is about to be laid. Let us begin. The world that built the Titanic was a world of extraordinary confidence. To understand the Titanic, you have to understand the world it was born into. The year 1912 sits near the peak of an era that historians would later call the Belle Epoque, the beautiful era. A period of relative peace and unprecedented prosperity in the industrialized nations of Europe and North America that had lasted since the end of the Franco-Prussian War in 1871, and that would be destroyed 2 years after the Titanic sank by the catastrophe of the First World War. In 1912, the world's great powers were at peace with each other, trading with each other, competing with each other commercially and technologically in ways that seemed to promise an indefinitely expanding future. The technologies that were transforming daily life, the motor car, the telephone, the electric light, the aeroplane, were still new enough to feel miraculous and old enough to seem reliable. The British Empire, the largest empire in history, covered approximately a quarter of the Earth's land surface and administered a quarter of the world's population from the offices of Whitehall and the drawing rooms of the country houses that the previous chapter of this channel described in such detail. The United States was in the middle of its Gilded Age, the period of extraordinary industrial wealth that had produced the great fortunes of Carnegie and Rockefeller and Astor, and that had made New York one of the most dynamic and most unequal cities on Earth. This was the world that needed the Titanic. Not needed in the sense of requiring a ship to cross the Atlantic, since ships had been crossing the Atlantic for centuries, but needed in a deeper sense, needed as an expression of what the world believed about itself, that it was getting bigger and faster and more powerful and more comfortable, and that there was no limit to how far in those directions it could go. The Titanic was not simply a ship. It was a statement, and like all the most confident statements, it was made just before the thing it was confident about turned out not to be true. The White Star Line and the race to build the biggest ships in the world. The company that ordered the Titanic was the White Star Line, a British shipping company that had been founded in the mid-19th century, and that by the early 20th century was one of the two dominant forces in the transatlantic passenger trade. Its great rival was the Cunard Line, and the competition between them for passengers and prestige drove the construction of ever larger and ever more luxurious ocean liners in a shipbuilding arms race that transformed the North Atlantic crossing from an ordeal into an experience. The White Star Line's strategy had always emphasized size and luxury over the sheer speed that Cunard pursued with its great ships, the Lusitania and the Mauretania. White Star wanted to offer its passengers the experience of crossing the Atlantic in conditions that rivaled or exceeded the best hotels ashore. When Cunard launched the Mauretania and the Lusitania in 1907, two ships that were not only the largest but the fastest afloat, White Star's managing director J. Bruce Ismay met with the company's principal financier, J.P. Morgan, and with the chairman of Harland and Wolff, Lord Pirrie, at a dinner party at Lord Pirrie's London home. The decision taken at that dinner party was to build not two but three ships that would surpass the Cunard vessels in size and luxury, even if they could not match them for speed. The three ships were to be called Olympic, Titanic, and Gigantic. The names alone tell you something about the ambitions of the men who chose them. They were reaching for mythology. They were naming their ships after the most powerful forces and the most powerful beings that the human imagination had ever produced. And they were doing so in the confident knowledge that the ships they were naming would be worthy of those names. The Titanic in Greek mythology were the primordial forces of the cosmos, the beings who preceded the gods themselves and whose overthrow was required before the ordered world could come into existence. To name a ship the Titanic was to claim for it a power that preceded and exceeded ordinary human scale. The name was not chosen carelessly. It was chosen to say something specific about what the ship was meant to represent. The construction of the Titanic at Harland and Wolff in Belfast was a feat of industrial ambition. The Titanic was built in the Harland and Wolff shipyard in Belfast, on the shores of Belfast Lough in the north of Ireland, which was at the time of the ship's construction the largest shipyard in the world. The contract to build the Olympic and the Titanic simultaneously required the construction of two enormous gantries, strong enough to support the weight of ships that would be larger than anything previously built. The gantries that were erected for the purpose were at the time of their construction the largest man-made structures in Ireland. They dominated the Belfast skyline for miles in every direction and became landmarks of the city in a way that the ships they were building never could be, since the ships would eventually leave and the gantries would remain. The Titanic's keel was laid on the 31st of March 1909. From that day until the ship's launch on the 31st of May 1911, a workforce of approximately 3,000 men labored on her construction in conditions that were by the standards of the time accepted as normal, and by the standards of our time almost unimaginably dangerous. Falls from the gantries and the scaffolding, burns from the riveting operations that were the primary method of joining the steel plates that formed the ship's hull, injuries from the machinery that operated throughout the yard. The men who built the Titanic were paid modest wages for skilled and dangerous work, and their names appear nowhere in the narrative of the ship's story with the prominence that they deserve. The Titanic was built with approximately 3 million rivets driven through the overlapping steel plates of the hull by teams of 4 men working with red-hot iron bolts heated in portable braziers and driven home with hammers before they could cool and lose their malleability. The noise of the Belfast shipyard in full production, the constant ringing of hammer on iron echoing across the city, was one of the defining sounds of Belfast in the Edwardian period, and a sound that the people who lived near the yard heard every working day for years at a stretch without ever fully habituating to it. The Titanic was launched without ceremony and without a name being given to her by a bottle of champagne, as was the tradition at most shipyard launchings. White Star Line launches were conducted without the naming ceremony as a matter of company policy. The ship that slid down the slipway and into Belfast Lough on the 31st of May 1911, before a crowd of approximately 100,000 spectators, was already the largest ship afloat. But she was not yet finished. She would spend the next 10 months in the fitting out basin, where her engines would be installed, her interiors completed, and the extraordinary luxury of her upper-class accommodations fitted out to the standards that White Star had promised. The design of the Titanic was a triumph of Edwardian engineering and ambition. The Titanic was 882 feet long, nearly 300 meters, which made her longer than the tallest buildings of her era were tall. She displaced approximately 52,000 tons of water, and her maximum speed was approximately 23 knots. She was powered by a combination of reciprocating steam engines and a central turbine that drove 3 propellers, a novel arrangement that allowed the engines to be more efficient than earlier designs had permitted. The coal that powered her boilers was stored in large bunkers along the lower decks and consumed in quantities that required a workforce of stokers and trimmers working in brutal heat 24 hours a day throughout the voyage. The ship was divided into 16 watertight compartments by transverse bulkheads that could be closed automatically or from the bridge by the flick of an electric switch. It was this system of watertight compartments that gave rise to the claim, made cautiously by the shipbuilders and enthusiastically amplified by the press and the public, that the Titanic was unsinkable. The claim was never made in those precise words by anyone in authority at Harland and Wolff. What was said in the technical literature was that the ship was designed to remain afloat with any 2 of her 16 compartments flooded. The iceberg would flood 5. The ship's layout divided its passengers into 3 classes, separated by physical barriers, by different deck access, and by standards of accommodation so different as to constitute almost entirely different experiences of being on the same vessel. First class occupied the upper decks and the most desirable midship positions, where the motion of the ship was least felt. Second class occupied a comfortable but less lavish section that on most other ships of the period would have qualified as first-class accommodation. Third class, steerage, occupied the lower decks forward and aft, the least desirable positions on the ship, with shared cabin accommodation and shared dining rooms and shared facilities that were by the standards of the time considered adequate, and by the standards of the Titanic's own publicity considerably better than steerage passengers had previously been offered. Life in first class on the Titanic was unlike anything that had existed at sea before. To travel first class on the Titanic was to be offered an experience that its designers had deliberately modelled on the finest hotels ashore. The first-class public rooms were decorated in historical styles, drawn from the palaces and great houses of Europe, the dining saloon in the style of the Jacobean period, the reception room in Louis XVI, the reading and writing room in Georgian, the smoking room in Georgian with inlaid mother-of-pearl panelling, the lounge in Louis XVI. The Café Parisien on B-deck offered a Parisian sidewalk cafe experience with wicker chairs and trellised walls and a view of the sea through large windows that made it feel, if you could forget, you were in the middle of the North Atlantic, like a corner of the right bank. The first-class dining saloon seated 550 people and was the largest room afloat. It occupied the full width of the ship on D-deck, and its meals were served from a menu of extraordinary elaboration that on the night of the 14th of April 1912 ran to 11 courses. Oysters and consomme and salmon and filet mignon and roast duckling, beef sirloin and peach in chartreuse jelly and eclairs and fresh fruit. All appeared in sequence before passengers who were travelling in a style that had never before been available at sea and that few hotels ashore could have matched. The first-class staterooms ranged from comfortable single cabins to elaborate suites that occupied the full width of the ship and contained their own private promenades on the outer deck. The most expensive suite on the Titanic cost approximately £870 for the voyage, which in 1912 was approximately the annual salary of a professional man of comfortable means. The Titanic also offered its first-class passengers a gymnasium with the latest exercise equipment, a swimming bath, which was novel enough to be a significant selling point, a Turkish bath and a squash court, and the famous veranda cafe where passengers could sit with a cup of coffee and feel the sea air while remaining entirely sheltered from it. The first-class experience on the Titanic was designed to make passengers forget that they were at sea at all, and it succeeded so completely that some of them were not frightened quickly enough when the sea reminded them. Second class on the Titanic was comfortable beyond the expectations of its passengers. The second-class accommodation on the Titanic was designed to a standard that would have been considered first class on almost any other ship then operating on the North Atlantic. The second-class dining saloon served meals from a set menu that was substantial and well prepared, and considerably better than the food most of its passengers would have eaten at home. The second-class cabins were small but private, with proper bunks rather than the open berths of steerage, and the second-class public rooms included a library and a smoking room, and a lounge that provided reasonable comfort for a reasonably long crossing. The second-class passengers on the Titanic were a mixed group that included professional people, teachers, clergymen, minor businessmen, families traveling to start new lives in America, and individuals making the crossing for purposes of business or personal circumstances that did not justify the expense of first class, but that allowed for something better than steerage. Among the second-class passengers on the maiden voyage was Lawrence Beasley, a science teacher from London, who would survive the sinking and write one of the most detailed and most widely read accounts of the disaster. His book, published within weeks of the sinking, described life aboard the Titanic in second class with the observational precision of a man trained to record what he sees, and the emotional honesty of a man who had survived something that he was still trying to understand. Third class on the Titanic, and what steerage really meant for the people who travelled there. The third-class passengers on the Titanic numbered approximately 700, and they came from everywhere, from Ireland and Scandinavia, and England, and Lebanon, and Croatia, and Finland, and China, and a dozen other countries and cultures that the manifests of the ship reflect in the diversity of their names. Many of them were emigrants, people who had decided or been compelled by economic necessity, or political pressure, or personal circumstance to leave the countries and communities they had grown up in, and to try their luck in the new world across the water. The experience of the Atlantic crossing for a third-class passenger was nothing like the experience of a first-class passenger, even on a ship that prided itself on the quality of its steerage accommodation. Third-class passengers were housed in cabins of 4 to 6 berths in the lower decks of the ship, separated from the upper decks by physical barriers and locked gates that reflected both the public health regulations of the era, which required the separation of steerage passengers from other classes to prevent the spread of the infectious diseases that immigration medical inspections were designed to detect, and the class assumptions of the Edwardian world that simply did not question the principle of separation. The third-class dining rooms served plain but plentiful food, and the facilities were considerably better than those on older ships. But the difference between the world of the first-class passenger eating 11-course dinners in the largest room afloat and the world of the third-class passenger eating stew in a communal dining room 2 decks below the waterline was not simply a difference of comfort or cuisine. It was a difference of possibility. The third-class passenger was not expected to walk the boat deck or use the gymnasium or take afternoon tea in the Café Parisien. The ship that was taking them to America was organized according to the same principles of class and exclusion that organized the society they were leaving and the society they were going to. The Titanic was a floating microcosm of the Edwardian world, and the Edwardian world was not an equal one. The crew of the Titanic were as varied and as human as the passengers they served. The Titanic sailed with a crew of approximately 890 people, ranging from Captain Edward John Smith, the most experienced and most celebrated captain in the White Star Fleet, to the 14-year-old bellboys who ran messages through the corridors. Captain Smith was making his final voyage before retirement on what was considered the most prestigious command in the merchant fleet. He was 62 years old and had spent 40 years at sea and had never lost a ship. He was a figure of considerable personal authority whose presence on the bridge was understood by passengers and crew alike as a guarantee of safety and competence. The senior officers who served under him were experienced men who knew the North Atlantic and knew their ship, and who would, in the hours after the collision, make decisions whose consequences they could not have fully foreseen. The wireless operators, Jack Phillips and Harold Bride, were not employed by White Star, but by the Marconi Company, whose wireless telegraphy equipment was one of the most significant technological innovations of the early 20th century, and whose presence on large ocean liners had transformed the communication possibilities of ships at sea. Phillips and Bride worked in shifts in the wireless room, processing the commercial messages of wealthy passengers and the navigational information that came from other ships. The stokers and trimmers who fed the boilers worked in the heat of the engine rooms and boiler rooms, in conditions that were as far from the elegance of the first-class promenade as it was possible to be, while remaining on the same ship. They were physically separated from the passenger areas of the vessel, and their existence was known to most passengers only in the abstract, as the unseen force that kept the ship moving through the water. They were, in the most literal sense, the engine of everything. The famous passengers of the Titanic and the stories they carried aboard. Among the approximately 1,300 passengers who sailed on the Titanic's maiden voyage were some of the most famous and most wealthy people in the world. John Jacob Astor IV was perhaps the wealthiest person on board, an American real estate magnate and developer whose personal fortune was estimated at approximately $87 million, a sum that in 1912 represented almost unimaginable wealth. He was traveling with his new wife Madeline, who was 18 years old to his 47, and who was 5 months pregnant. Their marriage had caused a scandal in New York society, and they had spent much of the preceding year traveling in Europe, waiting for the social temperature to cool. They were returning home on the Titanic. Benjamin Guggenheim was another member of one of America's great industrial dynasties, a man of considerable wealth and charm, who was traveling with his valet and his personal secretary, and with a French singer named Leontine Aubert, who was not his wife. Isidor Strauss and his wife Ida were among the most beloved passengers on the ship. Isidor was the co-owner of Macy's department store in New York and a man of enormous public respect. He and Ida had been married for 40 years, and their devotion to each other was such that Ida refused to enter a lifeboat without her husband, and Isidor refused the offer of a place in a lifeboat ahead of other men, while women and children were still waiting. They were last seen sitting together on deck chairs, holding hands as the ship went down. Margaret Brown, known to later generations as the unsinkable Molly Brown, was a Colorado mining heiress and social activist who had worked her way into the social world of Newport and New York, despite the condescension of the old money families who found her pushiness amusing. She would prove her strength of character in a lifeboat, where she argued with the officer in charge about going back for survivors in the water. J. Bruce Ismay, the managing director of the White Star Line, was also on board, a decision that would haunt him for the rest of his life because he survived when so many others did not. The maiden voyage from Southampton and the days before the iceberg. The Titanic departed Southampton on the 10th of April 1912 at noon, watched by enormous crowds on the dock, and by the crews of the ships moored in the port who came on deck to watch her pass. As she moved down the river test toward the open water, the displacement of water caused by her enormous hull snapped the mooring ropes of the American liner New York and swung the smaller ship toward the Titanic in a near collision that was avoided only by quick action from the tugs and from Captain Smith on the bridge. It was an inauspicious beginning that some would later remember as an omen of what was to come. The ship called at Cherbourg in France that evening to collect additional passengers who had crossed the channel by tender, and at Queenstown, now Cobb, in Ireland the following morning, where more passengers embarked and a large quantity of mail was loaded. Then she turned west and steamed out into the North Atlantic on the course that would carry her to New York in approximately 5 days. The first 3 days of the voyage were clear and cold and uneventful. The sea was calm in a way that was unusual for the North Atlantic in April. The lack of wind and the absence of swell made the crossing unusually smooth and contributed to the holiday atmosphere that prevailed in the first class and second class areas of the ship. Passengers met and formed friendships. They played cards in the smoking room and took the air on the boat deck and ate the extraordinary meals that the kitchens produced, and in the evenings listened to the ship's orchestra, which played in the reception rooms and the dining saloon, and on the decks when the weather permitted. The wireless room was busy with messages. Ice warnings began arriving on the 12th of April from other ships reporting bergs and field ice in the waters ahead. More warnings came on the 13th and the 14th. They were noted and in some cases passed to the bridge. The ship did not slow down. The iceberg warnings that were received, and what was done with them. The practice of ice avoidance on the North Atlantic in 1912 was governed less by formal regulation than by custom and judgment. Ships that received ice warnings from other vessels would note them, plot the reported positions, and adjust their courses or their speeds at the discretion of the captain. The standard response to ice warnings was not necessarily to slow down, but to post extra lookouts and to proceed with heightened alertness. The assumption underlying this practice was that a properly manned lookout would spot an iceberg in time to take avoiding action, an assumption that proved on the night of the 14th of April to be fatally overconfident. On the 14th of April alone, the Titanic received at least 6 separate ice warnings from other ships reporting bergs and field ice in the region directly ahead of the Titanic's course. The most significant of these came from the Californian, which reported at around 10:30 in the evening that she had stopped for the night surrounded by field ice. This message was received by wireless operator Jack Phillips, who was at that moment overwhelmed with a backlog of commercial messages for passengers that he was trying to transmit through the powerful relay station at Cape Race. He cut the Californian off mid-message and told her operator to stand by as he was busy with the Cape Race traffic. The full text of the Californian's warning, with its precise position information, was never formally passed to the bridge. The Titanic steamed on at approximately 22 knots into a sea so calm and so flat that it offered none of the usual visual cues that warned of ice in the vicinity. An iceberg at sea is normally surrounded by a ring of broken ice and by surf at its base, where the waves break against it. On the night of the 14th of April, there were no waves. The sea was as flat as glass, and there was no moon. The collision and the first hours of the disaster. At 23:40, on the night of the 14th of April 1912, the lookout in the Crow's Nest, Frederick Fleet, spotted the iceberg directly ahead and rang the warning bell 3 times and telephoned the bridge with the words "iceberg" right ahead. First Officer William Murdoch, who had the watch, ordered the helm hard to starboard and the engines reversed in an attempt to swing the bow of the ship away from the ice. The ship began to turn. It was not enough. 37 seconds after Fleet's warning, the iceberg scraped along the starboard side of the ship for a distance of approximately 300 feet below the waterline. The contact was surprisingly quiet and surprisingly brief. Many passengers sleeping in their cabins felt only a slight shudder, and some of them did not wake at all. Those who were awake described the sensation as the ship running over gravel, or as a distant rumbling that passed almost as soon as it began. The iceberg itself disappeared into the darkness astern and was seen only briefly by those on deck who were awake and looking. But in the 37 seconds between Fleet's warning and the collision, and in the approximately 10 seconds of contact, the iceberg had opened a series of small breaches and buckled plates along approximately 300 feet of the starboard hull, through which water was now flooding into 5 of the 16 watertight compartments. Thomas Andrews, the ship's designer from Harland and Wolff, who was travelling on the maiden voyage to note any problems that needed addressing, was woken and brought to assess the damage. He inspected the flooded compartments and did the mathematics that no one wanted him to do. The ship could stay afloat with 2 compartments flooded, perhaps 4. 5 was too many. With 5 compartments open to the sea, the bow would sink lower and lower until the water topped the bulkheads and flooded each successive compartment in turn. It was a process that could not be stopped. Andrews told Captain Smith that the ship had between 1 hour and 1 hour and 40 minutes before she sank. The time was approximately midnight. The lifeboats, why there were not enough, and how they were filled. The Titanic carried 20 lifeboats. Their total capacity was approximately 1,178 people. The number of people on board was approximately 2,224. Even if every lifeboat had been filled to its maximum capacity, there would not have been enough room for everyone on the ship. In the event the lifeboats were not filled to capacity, the first lifeboat to be lowered, Lifeboat 7, left the ship with 28 people in it, despite a capacity of 65. Part of the reason was that in the first hour after the collision, many passengers did not believe the ship was in serious danger. The night was calm, the ship seemed stable, and the lifeboats swinging on their davits over the dark water seemed to many passengers considerably less safe than the enormous solid ship beneath their feet. The order to put women and children into the lifeboats first was interpreted differently on the port side and the starboard side of the ship. On the starboard side, under the supervision of First Officer Murdoch, men were allowed into lifeboats if there were no women and children nearby. On the port side, under the supervision of Second Officer Lightoller, the rule was applied more strictly, and boats were lowered with empty seats rather than filled with available men. The class composition of the survivors reflected the geography of the ship. First-class passengers had easier access to the boat deck and received earlier and clearer information about what was happening. Third-class passengers, many of whom did not speak English, faced locked gates and language barriers, and the simple geographical disadvantage of being in the lowest decks of a ship that was sinking bow first and had to cover more distance to reach the boats. The survival rate for first-class passengers was approximately 62%. For second class, it was 41%. For third class, it was 25%. These numbers are the clearest single expression of what class meant on the Titanic and what class meant in the world the Titanic sailed from. The band that kept playing and what it meant that they did. Among the most enduring images of the Titanic disaster is that of the ship's orchestra continuing to play as the ship went down around them. The 8 musicians who formed the Titanic's orchestra were led by Wallace Hartley, a violinist from Colne in Lancashire, who had played on several White Star ships and who was engaged to be married to a woman named Maria Robinson. They were not a single orchestra, but 2 separate ensembles that played in different parts of the ship and only occasionally together. After the collision, the musicians began playing in the first-class reception room to provide music for the passengers gathering there and to maintain the atmosphere of calm that the officers were trying to project in the early stages of the emergency. As the situation became clearer and the evacuation moved to the boat deck, the musicians moved up too and continued to play in the open air while the lifeboats were loaded and lowered. The exact pieces they played in those final hours have been debated and romanticized in the century since the sinking. The famous claim that they played the hymn "Nearer My God to Thee" as the ship went under has been disputed by some survivors and supported by others. What is agreed is that they played until very near the end. None of them survived. All 8 musicians died in the North Atlantic on the night of the 14th of April 1912. They were not required to play. There was no order that compelled them to remain at their posts. They chose to stay, and they chose to play in what must be understood as one of the most remarkable acts of collective courage and professional dedication in the history of music. Wallace Hartley's body was recovered from the sea with his violin case strapped to his body. The violin was eventually returned to Maria Robinson and passed through several hands before being authenticated and sold at auction in 2014. for approximately £900,000. The instrument that played in the darkness above the sinking ship survived when its owner did not. The sinking itself, and what the final hours were like for those still on board. As the Titanic settled lower in the water and the angle of the deck increased toward the bow, the nature of the emergency became impossible to deny. The last lifeboats were lowered increasingly haphazardly as the deck tilted and the lights flickered, and the sounds from deep within the ship told everyone on board that the end was approaching. The distress rockets that had been fired from the bridge from approximately 12:45 in the morning had been seen by the Californian lying, stopped in the ice, approximately 10 to 20 miles away. The Californian's officers had seen the rockets and had discussed them without taking action. The wireless operator on the Californian had gone to sleep. No one woke him to try to contact the ship firing the rockets. The Californian remained stopped while the Titanic sank. At approximately 2:17 in the morning, the forward funnel of the Titanic collapsed, and the ship began its final plunge. Eyewitness accounts from the lifeboats described the stern of the ship rising out of the water to a near vertical angle before the hull broke in two, and the stern section fell back briefly to the horizontal before sinking in its turn. The lights of the Titanic went out at approximately 2:20 in the morning. The screaming of the approximately 1,500 people left in the water after the sinking was described by every survivor who heard it as the most terrible sound they had ever experienced. It lasted for approximately 20 minutes. Then it faded. Then it stopped. The officers in the lifeboats were largely reluctant to go back. They feared the lifeboats would be swamped by desperate people in the water. Only one boat, Lifeboat 14 under the command of 5th Officer Lowe, went back to search for survivors. They found 4. The sea temperature that night was approximately -2 degrees Celsius. A person in the water at that temperature loses consciousness within 15 to 30 minutes and dies within an hour. Most of the 1,500 people in the water were dead long before any lifeboat reached them. The rescue by the Carpathia and the arrival in New York. The ship that received the Titanic's distress signals and responded was the RMS Carpathia, a Cunard liner bound for the Mediterranean that was approximately 58 miles away when the Titanic struck the iceberg. Her captain, Arthur Rostron, was woken at 12:25 in the morning and immediately gave the order to turn the ship around and steam at maximum speed toward the Titanic's last reported position. He then organized his crew with extraordinary efficiency, preparing the ship's medical facilities, organizing food and blankets and hot drinks for survivors, positioning crew members at ladders and ropes along the ship's sides to assist survivors into the vessel, and pushing his engines to a speed the Carpathia had never previously achieved in the race to reach the stricken liner in time. The Carpathia arrived at the site of the sinking at 4:10 in the morning to find the sea covered with wreckage and lifeboats, and with the bodies of the dead floating among the debris in the darkness. The survivors were taken aboard one by one over the course of the next 4 hours. 705 people were rescued. 1,517 people died. The Carpathia arrived in New York on the evening of the 18th of April in the rain, to crowds of tens of thousands on the docks and in the streets surrounding the pier, to a press corps whose hunger for information had been building for 4 days, and to the families of the survivors and the dead who waited in the crowd, not knowing until the gangways were lowered whether the person they were waiting for was among those who had been saved. The aftermath, the inquiries, and the changes that followed the disaster. The sinking of the Titanic produced 2 formal inquiries one American, and one British, that together constitute the most comprehensive investigation of a maritime disaster in the history of navigation to that point. The American inquiry, chaired by Senator William Alden Smith of Michigan, began within days of the Carpathia's arrival in New York and heard testimony from officers, crew members, and surviving passengers over a period of several weeks. Senator Smith was criticized at the time and has been criticized since for his lack of maritime expertise, but his inquiry established the key facts of the disaster with a thoroughness that the British inquiry would build upon. The British inquiry, chaired by Lord Mersey, heard testimony from 96 witnesses and produced a report of considerable length that identified the primary cause of the sinking as the speed at which the ship was travelling through waters where ice had been reported, and the failure to heed the ice warnings adequately. The inquiries produced a series of recommendations that were translated into changes in maritime law and practice with a speed that reflected the shock of the disaster. The International Ice Patrol was established to monitor iceberg movements in the North Atlantic and to warn ships of their positions, a service that has operated continuously ever since. The requirement for ships to carry sufficient lifeboats for every person on board became mandatory. The requirement for wireless operators to maintain a 24-hour watch was introduced, directly addressing one of the factors that had contributed to the Californians' failure to respond. The regulations that governed the conduct of lifeboat drills and the training of crew in emergency procedures were strengthened across the shipping industry. These changes saved lives. They continue to save lives. The 1,517 people who died on the Titanic died in part so that the systems that protect everyone who sails could be improved. J. Bruce Ismay, and the question of what it meant to survive. Among the most controversial figures in the Titanic story is J. Bruce Ismay, the managing director of the White Star Line, who was on board the ship as a passenger and who stepped into one of the last collapsible lifeboats as it was being launched from the starboard side. He survived. The press on both sides of the Atlantic treated his survival as a moral failure of the most serious kind. William Randolph Hearst's newspapers led the charge, depicting Ismay as a coward who had saved himself while women and children drowned around him. The nickname that attached itself to him in the American press, J. Brute Ismay, tells you something about the temperature of the coverage. Ismay's defense, offered at both inquiries, was that he had helped to load passengers into lifeboats and that he had stepped into the last collapsible when there were no more women or children in the immediate vicinity. The testimony of other survivors supported this account in its essentials, but the social and psychological reality of his survival was that he was the man who had ordered the ship that had killed 1,500 people, and he had got off it alive. Whatever the technical justification for his survival, the burden of it was more than he could fully carry. He resigned from the White Star Line after the inquiries and retired to a relatively reclusive life in Ireland, where he died in 1937, 25 years after the sinking, having avoided public life as completely as a man of his former prominence could manage. His story raises questions that have no clean answers about survival and responsibility and what we owe to others in moments of extreme collective danger. Those questions are part of why the Titanic story continues to disturb us, even when we know exactly what happened and exactly how it ended. The discovery of the wreck in 1985 and what it revealed. For 73 years, the Titanic lay undisturbed on the floor of the North Atlantic, approximately 3,800 meters below the surface, in two main sections separated by approximately 600 meters of debris field, in a place that was known approximately but had never been precisely located. The search for the wreck had been attempted several times before the expedition, led by Robert Ballard of the Woods Hole Oceanographic Institution and Jean-Louis Michel of the French Research Institute IFREMA, located it on the 1st of September 1985. Ballard's team had developed a new deep-sea search technology, a towed video sled called Argo, that could cover large areas of the ocean floor and transmit images to the surface in real time. The discovery came in the early hours of the morning when Argo's cameras showed the first recognizable debris from the wreck, a boiler, lying on the ocean floor. Ballard described the moment of recognition as one of the most powerful of his career. The debris that surrounded the wreck told the story of the sinking in a way that no document or testimony could fully replicate. Personal belongings scattered across miles of ocean floor, shoes lying in pairs, their owners long gone, but the leather preserved by the cold and the darkness. Wine bottles still sealed, chamber pots, suitcases, a child's doll. The wreck itself, photographed in detail for the first time in subsequent expeditions, showed the extent of the damage sustained in the sinking and the degree to which the cold, the salt water, and the iron-eating bacteria that live in the deep ocean had worked on the steel over 73 years. The discovery of the wreck transformed the Titanic story from a historical event into something simultaneously more and less abstract, more concrete, because the physical reality of the ship was now documented. Less abstract, because the wreck on the ocean floor reminded everyone who saw the images that this had been a real place where real people had died, and where real people's belongings were still scattered across miles of darkness and cold. What the Titanic means now, and why we keep returning to its story. The Titanic has never stopped meaning something. The books and the films and the documentaries and the exhibitions and the ongoing recovery of artifacts from the wreck and the legal battles over who has the right to recover them, and the annual commemorations on the anniversary of the sinking, all attest to a hold on the human imagination. That shows no sign of weakening after more than a century. Part of the reason is the story itself. It has everything that a great story requires. A beautiful and hubristic creation, a cast of characters from every level of society, a villain in the form of human overconfidence, heroes and cowards, and people who were simply trying to survive. A catastrophe that unfolded with the slow inevitability of classical tragedy, and an ending that still hurts, even when you know it is coming. But the deeper reason we keep returning to the Titanic is what it says about the world that built it. The Titanic was the product of a civilization that believed in its own unlimited capacity and in the unlimited expansion of human power over the natural world. The iceberg was not impressed. The cold water of the North Atlantic was not impressed. And the 1,500 people who died in it paid with their lives for a confidence that the people who built the ship had not entirely earned. The Titanic sank in 1912. 2 years later, the world went to war in a conflict that would kill 17 million people, and that would finally end the long Edwardian confidence that the Titanic had been its most spectacular expression of. The ship went down before the era did. But in going down, it announced the end with a clarity and a finality that the political assassinations and the mobilizations of 1914 would only confirm. The wireless operators and the last communications from the sinking ship. Jack Phillips and Harold Bride, the two wireless operators on the Titanic, were among the most important figures in the unfolding disaster, and their story illuminates both the capabilities and the limitations of the new communications technology that the Edwardian world was only beginning to understand. When Captain Smith came to the wireless room shortly after midnight and told Phillips to send the distress signal, Phillips began transmitting CKD, the established distress call, followed by the Titanic's position. Bride suggested they also try the new signal SOS, which had been internationally agreed upon in 1906, but had not yet come into widespread use. Phillips transmitted both. Multiple ships received the signals. The Carpathia responded immediately and came at full speed. The Frankfurt responded and was directed toward the Titanic's position. The Olympic, the Titanic's sister ship, responded and maintained contact through the long night. Several ships that received the signals were too far away to help. The Californian, the closest ship, had its wireless switched off for the night. Phillips stayed at his post, transmitting continuously until the water was rising in the wireless room, and Bride told him to save himself. Phillips left the wireless room and was last seen clinging to a lifeboat. He did not survive. His body was never recovered. Bride survived, rescued from a collapsible lifeboat that floated upside down, with its survivors standing on its hull. He had frostbitten feet and injuries to his ankles, but he was alive. He was taken aboard the Carpathia, and within hours was back at a wireless set, helping to transmit the survivor list to a frantic world. The dedication of these two young men in the hours of the sinking is one of the less celebrated but most genuinely heroic aspects of the disaster. They stayed. They transmitted. One of them died at his post. The other returned to his post as soon as he was physically capable. The wireless that connected the Titanic to the world was the same wireless that failed to connect the Californian to the Titanic. Technology is only as good as the human decisions that govern its use. The Californian, and the question that has never been fully answered. No aspect of the Titanic disaster has generated more controversy than the role of the SS Californian, a Leyland Line cargo ship that was stopped in the ice field that night, approximately 10 to 20 miles from the Titanic. The Californian's wireless operator, Cyril Evans, had switched off his equipment and gone to sleep at around 11:30 after being cut off by Jack Phillips on the Titanic when he tried to relay the ice warning. The Californian's officers on the bridge during the night saw rockets being fired in the distance. 8 rockets in all. They reported them to their captain, Stanley Lord, who was sleeping in the chart room. Captain Lord was told of the rockets and told that the ship firing them did not respond to Morse lamp signals. He did not get up. He did not order the wireless operator woken. He did not steam toward the rockets. He gave no orders. The Californian remained stopped while the rockets were fired, and while the Titanic sank, and while 1,500 people died in the water. The British inquiry found that the Californian could have reached the Titanic in time to save many or all of the people who died if Captain Lord had responded to the rockets. Captain Lord spent the rest of his long life. He died in 1962, arguing that the ship firing the rockets had not been the Titanic, and that he had not understood the urgency of what his officers were reporting. The debate about the Californian has continued ever since, with some investigators supporting Lord's account, and others finding it inadequate to explain why a captain who was told his officers were watching rockets being fired from a nearby ship went back to sleep without ordering any action. The Californian question sits at the heart of the Titanic story as its most troubling, unanswerable. Not because the facts are disputed, but because the human decisions behind those facts remain impossible to fully explain or excuse. The people who survived and the lives they lived afterward. The 705 people who were rescued by the Carpathia went on to live lives that were shaped in ways both visible and invisible by what they had experienced on the night of the 14th of April 1912. Some spoke about it constantly and publicly. Lawrence Beasley wrote his account within weeks and lectured about the disaster for years. Harold Bride gave newspaper interviews and testified at both inquiries. Margaret Brown became a celebrity of the disaster and used her prominence to advocate for the survivors and to campaign for better maritime safety. Others never spoke about it. Second Officer Charles Lightoller, who commanded lifeboat after lifeboat through the long night of the sinking and who was the most senior surviving officer, gave his testimony at both inquiries with a loyalty to his company and his service that some have interpreted as less than fully candid. He went on to a distinguished career at sea, and in the Second World War rescued men from the beaches of Dunkirk in his own yacht. J. Bruce Ismay retired from public life and was rarely seen. Captain Arthur Rostron of the Carpathia received a gold medal from the American Congress and was celebrated as a hero wherever he went. The survivors who were not famous, the third-class passengers who had made it into lifeboats and who arrived in New York with nothing, the stewards and the stewardesses who had guided passengers to the boats and then been left with no boat of their own, the engine room crew who had kept the pumps running and the lights on until the water took them, went largely unrecorded in the immediate aftermath, in a pattern that was entirely consistent with the way the world they lived in recorded things. The wealthy and the famous were documented. The ordinary and the unnamed were not, but they were there, and their experience of the disaster was as real and their loss as complete as that of anyone whose name appears in the history books. And so we come gently to the end of our night on the North Atlantic. We have stood in the Harland and Wolff shipyard and watched the keel of the greatest ship in the world being laid. We have walked the decks of a floating palace and sat in its dining saloon and heard its orchestra play and felt the extraordinary confidence of the world that built it. We have followed the iceberg warnings that were received and not acted upon, and felt the 37 seconds between Frederick Fleet's warning and the moment the ice touched the hull. We have stood on the boat deck in the cold and watched the lifeboats go down and listened to the band play until the end. We have sat with Isidore and Edith Strauss on their deck chairs and understood something about love and about choice. We have felt the sea temperature of the North Atlantic in April and understood what it meant for the 1,500 people in the water. We have watched the lights of the ship go out from the lifeboat, where the survivors sat in silence and heard the sound that every survivor said they would never forget for as long as they lived. The Titanic sank. That is the fact. But around that fact is the whole enormous human story of the world that built the ship and the people who sailed on it, and the decisions that were made, and the decisions that were not, and the 1,517 people who died, and the 705 who lived, and the world that was changed by what happened in the 2 hours and 40 minutes between the collision and the sinking. It matters because they mattered. Every name on the manifest, every face in the photographs, every person in the lifeboats, and every person who was not. They were real. The cold water was real. The darkness was real. And the story we tell about them is the least we can do to honor the reality of what they experienced. If this quiet journey through the night of the Titanic brought you some peace, I would love it if you liked or subscribed, or simply left a thought below. It helps others find their way here too, one sleepy soul at a time. And if there is still some wakefulness left in you, there should be another calm history waiting on the screen for you now. But for this moment, there is nothing more to follow. Let the North Atlantic settle back into its darkness. Let the lights go out one last time and stay out. Let your breathing become slow and even and easy. The ship has found its resting place. The story has been told, and you are warm and safe and exactly where you need to be. Sleep well. Good night. The people who built the Titanic and what happened to them when she sank. The workers of the Harland and Wolff shipyard who spent 2 years building the Titanic did not sail on her. They stood on the docks of Belfast and watched her leave, and then went back to work on the next commission. When the news of the sinking reached Belfast, it was received in a city that had an intimate relationship with the ship that the passengers and the press did not share. The men who had driven the rivets and fitted the plates and installed the engines and decorated the staterooms knew the ship from the inside out in a way that no passenger could. They knew its weaknesses as well as its strengths. They knew which sections of the hull had been troublesome to fit, and which watertight doors had needed adjustment, and which rivets had gone in harder than they should have. The question of the rivets became one of the most technically significant aspects of the subsequent investigation into the sinking. Research conducted in the 1990s and 2000s on the metallurgy of the rivets recovered from the wreck site suggested that the rivets used in some sections of the bow, the sections that struck the iceberg, were of a lower grade of iron than the steel rivets used elsewhere, and may have been more brittle in the cold water temperatures of the North Atlantic. If the rivets in those sections had held longer, or if the seams they fastened had not opened so readily on impact, the flooding might have been slower, and the ship might have stayed afloat long enough for the Carpathia to arrive before it sank. This research is not universally accepted, and the question of whether different rivets would have made a decisive difference remains genuinely uncertain. But it reminds us that the Titanic was built by human hands with human materials in human conditions, and that the gap between the mythology of the unsinkable ship and the physical reality of the object that went to sea was present from the moment the keel was laid. The music that was played, and the songs that people sang as the night went on. The musical life of the Titanic in the hours of the sinking is one of the most richly documented aspects of the disaster, precisely because music is one of the things human beings reach for when the situation has gone beyond ordinary language. The 8 musicians who made up the Titanic's orchestra had been engaged to provide entertainment throughout the voyage, playing at mealtimes and in the public rooms in the evenings, and at the Sunday morning divine service that Captain Smith conducted in the first-class dining saloon on the morning of the 14th of April, the last Sunday the ship would sail. The hymns sung at that service included "O God our help in ages past," and "Eternal Father strong to save." The naval hymn, whose verse for those in peril on the sea must have seemed peculiarly prescient to anyone who remembered it in the hours of the sinking. The repertoire that the orchestra played in the final hours was drawn from the same popular and light classical music that they had been playing throughout the voyage. Ragtime tunes, hymn tunes, popular waltzes, the kind of music that required no special emotional interpretation and that could be played by men who were frightened in conditions that were increasingly difficult to play in at all. The survivors who mentioned the music in their accounts did so almost without exception as an expression of gratitude. It helped in the chaos and the cold and the growing terror of what was happening. The music helped. It gave the brain something to organize around. It communicated that someone was in control enough to still be playing. It was, in the most fundamental sense, a human response to an inhuman situation, and the men who provided it died in the water of the North Atlantic at approximately 2:20 in the morning, having given everything they had. The White Star Line and how it responded to the disaster. The White Star Line's response to the sinking of its most celebrated ship was shaped by the twin imperatives of corporate self-preservation and genuine shock at what had happened. The company's first communications in the hours after the disaster were confused and sometimes contradictory, reflecting both the limitations of wireless technology at the time and a corporate instinct to control information that served the company badly in the long run. J. P. Morgan, the American financier who controlled the International Mercantile Marine, of which the White Star Line was a subsidiary, had been booked on the Titanic's maiden voyage, but cancelled his reservation at the last minute for reasons that have never been entirely satisfactorily explained, and that generated conspiracy theories almost immediately. He was visiting the spa at Aix-les-Bains in France when the news of the sinking reached him. The White Star Line paid compensation to the families of those who had died on terms that were widely considered inadequate and that reflected both the limits of maritime law at the time and the economic reality that the company was facing the total loss of a ship that was insured for only a fraction of its replacement cost. The company continued to operate for several more decades before eventually merging with Cunard in 1934 to form the Cunard White Star Line that would carry passengers across the Atlantic until the age of commercial aviation made the ocean liner redundant as a form of practical transport. The Olympic, the Titanic's sister ship, continued in service until 1935 and is the reason we know so much about what the Titanic looked like, since the two ships were nearly identical in design and the Olympic provided the visual reference for every subsequent representation of her lost sister. The changes to maritime law and how the disaster made the sea safer. The practical legacy of the Titanic disaster was a comprehensive reform of the international regulations governing the safety of passenger ships that transformed the experience of sea travel for everyone who has sailed since 1912. The first and most immediate change was the requirement for every ship to carry sufficient lifeboat capacity for every person on board. This seems obvious now. It was not obvious in 1912. The Board of Trade regulations that governed British shipping had last been updated in 1894 and required lifeboat capacity based on the tonnage of the ship rather than the number of people aboard. The Titanic carried exactly the number of lifeboats required by those outdated regulations, and in fact carried slightly more than the minimum required. The regulations had simply not kept pace with the growth in the size of ships and the consequent growth in the numbers of people sailing on them. The second major change was the establishment of a continuous wireless watch on all ships carrying wireless equipment. Had the Californian's operator been awake and listening, the Titanic's distress calls would have been received by the nearest ship, and the response could have been immediate. The requirement for continuous watch was introduced within months of the disaster and made the communications infrastructure of the sea considerably more reliable than it had been. The International Convention for the Safety of Life at Sea, the SOLAS Convention, was first agreed in 1914 as a direct response to the disaster and has been updated multiple times since to incorporate advances in technology and changes in maritime practice. It remains the primary international instrument governing ship safety, and its existence is a direct legacy of the night the Titanic sank. The artifacts recovered from the wreck and the ethical questions they raised. The discovery of the Titanic in 1985 opened a new and contentious chapter in the ship's story. The question of what should be done with the wreck and with the artifacts that could be recovered from it, was not simply a legal question, though it was that too. It was a moral question about the relationship between history and recovery, between the public interest in understanding what happened and the private interest of those who had lost family members in the disaster in having the site of their deaths treated with appropriate respect. The relatives of those who died argued, and continue to argue, that the Titanic is a mass grave and that the recovery of artifacts from the site is a form of disturbance of the dead that should not be permitted. The organizations that have conducted salvage operations have argued that the recovery of artifacts for conservation, exhibition, and historical study serves the public interest in understanding the disaster and preserving objects that would otherwise be destroyed by the bacteria and the corrosion that are slowly consuming the wreck. More than 5,000 artifacts have been recovered from the site since the first salvage operation in 1987. They are housed in collections around the world and have been exhibited to millions of people who would otherwise have no tangible connection to the reality of what the Titanic was. A pair of shoes, a leather suitcase, a pocket watch stopped at the moment of immersion, a bottle of perfume still sealed, a menu from the last dinner. These objects speak in a register that no document or testimony can quite match. They are evidence not just of the sinking, but of the living, of the people who packed them and carried them on board and lost them in the most famous shipwreck in history. The debate about whether they should have been recovered at all will not be settled here, and perhaps cannot be settled anywhere. But it is a debate worth having, because it goes to the heart of what we owe the dead and what the dead leave us with. The Titanic in popular culture and why the story keeps being told. The Titanic entered popular culture almost immediately after it sank and has never left it. The first film about the disaster was made in 1912, the same year as the sinking, by Dorothy Gibson, a silent film actress who was herself a Titanic survivor and who wore in the film the same dress she had worn on the night of the disaster. Silent films, stage productions, novels, and popular songs followed throughout the 1910s and 20s. The disaster entered the folk music tradition of both Britain and America almost immediately, generating ballads and blues songs that treated the sinking as a moral lesson, a divine judgment on human arrogance, a parable about the fate of the rich and the fate of the poor, and a story about individual heroism and individual failure that fitted the narrative traditions of both cultures. The 1957 British film, A Night to Remember, based on Walter Lord's meticulous 1955 book of the same name, is still considered by many to be the most accurate and most moving of all the dramatizations of the disaster. It established the visual and narrative template for almost all subsequent treatments. James Cameron's 1997 film Titanic was the highest-grossing film in history at the time of its release, and introduced the story to a generation for whom the disaster was remote history rather than living memory. Its success demonstrated that the emotional core of the Titanic story, the beauty and the tragedy and the human drama of who survived and who did not, retained its power across generations and across cultures in a way that few historical events have managed. The story keeps being told because it keeps mattering. It keeps mattering because it is about things that do not change. Overconfidence, class and its consequences, the decisions people make when everything is going wrong, what love looks like when there is not enough room in the lifeboat. These are not Edwardian questions. They are permanent ones. And the Titanic puts them before us with a clarity and a force that makes it impossible, even after a century, to look away. The stokers and the engine room crew who kept the lights burning until the end. Among the least celebrated heroes of the Titanic disaster are the men who worked in the engine rooms and boiler rooms in the hours between the collision and the sinking. When the iceberg struck, the men below were among the first to know that something serious had happened. The water that flooded into the lower compartments drove them upward through the ship as the flooding advanced from compartment to compartment. But the engineers who operated the ship's machinery remained at their posts, long after it was clear that the ship was going to sink, because the pumps they were operating and the engines that powered them were keeping the lights on and the wireless running and giving every minute of extra time that they could to the people on the decks above them. Chief Engineer Joseph Bell led a team of 35 engineers, none of whom survived the sinking. They were last seen at their posts in the engine room, doing what engineers do, keeping the systems running, maintaining the power that made it possible for everything else to function. Their names appear on the memorial to the engineers of the Titanic that stands in Southampton, the city from which the Titanic sailed and which lost more residents to the disaster than any other city in Britain. Southampton was a maritime city, and many of the Titanic's crew had been recruited there. The neighborhoods around the docks lost husbands and fathers and sons in numbers that left entire streets bereaved, and that shaped the community's memory of the disaster in ways that persisted through generations. The Engineers Memorial in Southampton records the names of men who died doing their jobs in conditions that no training had prepared them for, and whose deaths allowed other people to live who might otherwise have been lost much sooner. Their contribution to the survival of the 705 who were rescued by the Carpathia is as real as the contribution of anyone else whose name appears in the story. The women of the Titanic and the choices they were forced to make. The instruction to put women and children first into the lifeboat placed the women of the Titanic in a position that was simultaneously privileged and devastating. Privileged because it gave them priority access to the means of survival. Devastating because it forced them to leave behind the people they loved most. The women who boarded the lifeboats in those hours did so in many cases only because they were told to. Only because officers and crew and husbands pushed them toward the boats they would not otherwise have chosen to enter and away from the men they would not otherwise have chosen to leave. The women in the lifeboats watched the ship go down. They heard the sound of 1,500 people in the water, fading over 20 minutes into silence. They sat in boats that were mostly too full or not full enough in the absolute darkness and the terrible cold for the hours between the sinking and the arrival of the Carpathia, with nothing to do but wait, and nothing to think except what they had seen and who they had left. Ida Strauss refused to enter a lifeboat and died with her husband. Rosa Abbott jumped into the sea from a collapsible lifeboat and was pulled back into another boat. She survived. Her two sons did not. Melvina Dean, the youngest survivor at 2 months old, was placed in a mailbag and lowered into a lifeboat by her mother, who also survived. Her father did not. Melvina Dean lived until 2009, 97 years after the sinking. The last surviving passenger from the Titanic. She had no memory of the night itself, having been 2 months old, but she spent much of her later life engaging with the story and with the community of Titanic enthusiasts and researchers who sought her out as the final living connection to the ship and the night and the people who were on it. She died on the 31st of May 2000 98 years to the day after the Titanic was launched in Belfast. The children on the Titanic and what happened to them. Among the most heartbreaking aspects of the Titanic disaster is what happened to the children who were on board. There were approximately 109 children on the Titanic, ranging from infants to teenagers. Of these, 56 survived and 53 died. The survival rate for children was considerably better than for adult men and reflects the priority given to them in the loading of the lifeboats. But it also reflects the geography of the ship and the circumstances of the individual families on board. First-class children had a survival rate of almost 100%. Second-class children had a survival rate of approximately 84%. Third-class children had a survival rate of approximately 34%. The disparity is stark and speaks directly to the realities of class and of the physical geography of the ship, and of the information available to different groups of passengers at the critical moments when decisions about lifeboats were being made. Among the children who died were Sidney Goodwin, aged 15 months, whose body was found floating in the sea after the sinking, and who could not be identified for 93 years because no one who survived knew him. He was known for decades as the unknown child and buried in Halifax, Nova Scotia, where many of the recovered bodies were taken. In 2007, DNA testing finally identified him as Sidney Leslie Goodwin, the son of Frederick and Augusta Goodwin, who had sold everything they owned to emigrate to America and who had lost not just Sidney but their other 5 children and each other in the sinking. The entire Goodwin family died. Sidney's identity, established 95 years after his death, restored a name to one small body in the long anonymous count of the dead. The ice that sank the Titanic and where it came from. The iceberg that sank the Titanic began its life approximately 15,000 years ago as snow falling on the Greenland ice sheet. Over millennia, that snow compressed into ice, and the ice moved slowly toward the sea in the great glaciers that flow from the interior of Greenland to its coast. Sometime in the months before the Titanic's maiden voyage, probably around late 1911 or early 1912, a section of the glacier carved into the sea, as icebergs do, dropping from the glacier face into the cold water of the North Atlantic. From there, the iceberg drifted south on the Labrador Current through the cold waters of the North Atlantic toward the shipping lanes that connected Europe to North America. By the night of the 14th of April 1912, it had drifted into a position approximately 41 degrees north latitude and 50 degrees west longitude, directly in the path of the Titanic's course. The iceberg that survivors described seeing was estimated to be between 50 and 100 feet above the waterline and approximately 200 to 400 feet in length. Only approximately 1/10 of an iceberg's mass is visible above the waterline. The bulk of it, the part that tore through the hull of the Titanic, was invisible beneath the surface of the sea. The piece of Greenland glacier that ended the Titanic's maiden voyage was a piece of the natural world operating entirely indifferently to the plans and the certainties of the human civilization that had sent its largest ship into its path. The iceberg did not know it was sinking the greatest ship in the world. It was simply doing what icebergs do, drifting south, melting slowly, being there when the ship arrived. The memorials and how the world chose to remember those who died. The Titanic dead are commemorated in memorials in the cities and countries that lost the most people. Southampton, which lost more residents than any other city, has several memorials, including the Engineers Memorial in East Park and the Musicians Memorial and the general memorial to the crew that stands in Andrews Park in the city centre. Belfast, where the ship was built, opened the Titanic Belfast Museum in 2012, the centenary of the sinking, on the site of the Harland and Wolff shipyard, where the Titanic was built. It is now the most visited tourist attraction in Ireland. Washington, D.C. has a memorial to the men of the Titanic erected by the women of America in recognition of the men who stood back from the lifeboats so that women and children could board. New York, where the ship was heading, has a Titanic Memorial Lighthouse that was originally erected on the roof of the Seamen's Church Institute and that still stands, relocated, near the South Street Seaport. Halifax, Nova Scotia, where the cable ships that recovered bodies from the sea brought their recovered dead, has the largest collection of Titanic graves in the world, in the Fairview Lawn Cemetery, where 121 victims are buried in rows whose arrangement reflects the curve of the ship's hull. These memorials are not simply about grief. They are about the insistence that the people who died should not be reduced to a number, 1,517, however accurate and important that number is. They are the world's attempt to keep faith with the individual reality of each of those deaths in the face of the tendency of history to aggregate and abstract what were in fact separate and individual human endings. Every name carved in stone is a resistance to that tendency. Every name is a person, and every person deserves to be remembered as one. The Titanic's sister ships and how they ended. The Titanic was not the only ship of her class. She had two sisters. The Olympic, the first of the three to be completed, was launched in October 1910 and entered service in June 1911, 10 months before the Titanic sailed on her maiden voyage. The Olympic had a long and eventful career that included a collision with RMS Hawk in September 1911 that required extensive repairs at Harland and Wolff, and that has been the subject of subsequent conspiracy theories suggesting that the Olympic and the Titanic were secretly switched, and that it was the damaged Olympic, not the Titanic, that sank. These theories have been comprehensively refuted by the physical evidence from the wreck and by the documentary record, but they continue to circulate as a reminder of how powerfully the desire to find deeper explanations for the disaster can override the evidence. The Olympic served as a troop ship in the First World War and is known to have rammed and sunk a German submarine in 1918, earning her the nickname Old Reliable. She continued in passenger service until 1935, when she was withdrawn and sold for scrapping at a time when the Depression had reduced the demand for luxury ocean travel to a level that could not support 3 ships of her class. The third sister, originally named Gigantic, was renamed Britannic before she was completed in the aftermath of the Titanic disaster, when the name Gigantic seemed somewhat less appropriate than it had before. She was requisitioned as a hospital ship at the outbreak of the First World War before entering commercial service, and was sunk in the Aegean Sea in November 1916 after striking a mine, with the loss of 30 lives out of a complement of over 1,000. The relatively low loss of life on the Britannic reflected the lessons learned from the Titanic, including the presence of sufficient lifeboats for everyone on board and a crew that had been trained in their use. The 3 ships of the Olympic class between them span the entire arc of the Edwardian era and the First World War. From the optimism of the pre-war years through the catastrophe of the sinking and the transformation of everything that followed, the night sky above the Titanic and what the stars witnessed. One of the details that survivors consistently mentioned in their accounts of the night of the sinking was the extraordinary clarity and brilliance of the night sky. With no moon and no cloud, and the flat calm sea reflecting nothing but the darkness. The stars above the Titanic on the night of the 14th of April 1912 were of a brilliance that many survivors had never seen before and would never forget. They described a sky so full of stars that the horizon between the sea and the sky was difficult to distinguish. The stars reflected in the mirror smooth water below, creating the illusion of being suspended in space. Some survivors said they thought the beauty of the sky was one of the reasons the night felt so unreal in the early hours of the disaster. The stars were so beautiful and so still, and the air was so cold and clear that the emergency happening on the ship seemed for a time like something that could not quite be true. The irony that this beautiful night was also the night most conducive to the disaster is not lost on anyone who thinks about it carefully. The flat calm that made the stars so visible and the sea so mirror smooth was the same flat calm that removed the visual cues that would normally have indicated ice in the vicinity. The absence of waves breaking against the base of the iceberg, the absence of the swell that would normally have surrounded it, the beautiful moonless night that made the stars magnificent also made the iceberg nearly invisible until the lookouts could see it 37 seconds before impact. The stars that survivors found so extraordinary were the same stars that had shone on the North Atlantic for billions of years before the first ship sailed under them, and that would continue to shine long after the Titanic's story was told and retold and eventually forgotten by everyone alive who had heard it. On the night of the 14th of April 1912, they shone on a ship that was about to sink, and on the people in the water after it sank, and on the lifeboats drifting in the dark, and on the Carpathia racing through the night to reach them with the same indifferent hand. Perfect brilliance that they always had and always would. The experience of being in the lifeboat and waiting in the dark. The survivors who reached the lifeboat faced hours of waiting in conditions that were in their own way almost as terrifying as the sinking itself had been. The lifeboats were small and cold and sat low in the water in a sea that was calm but dark and that surrounded them in every direction with nothing but the same emptiness that had surrounded the ship before it sank. The temperature of the air that night was approximately -1 degree Celsius. The people in the lifeboats were dressed for a warm ship interior, not for an open boat in the North Atlantic in April. Many had left without coats or without shoes. Some were in their nightclothes. The cold was a sustained and deepening assault on every person in every boat that lasted from the moment they entered the water until the Carpathia arrived at approximately 4:10 in the morning, approximately 2 hours after the Titanic went down. The darkness was absolute. After the ship's lights went out, there was nothing to look at but the stars and the sea and the faint shapes of the other lifeboats visible nearby. The silence after the sounds from the water faded was described by survivors as one of the most difficult things to bear. While the sounds continued, there was something happening. When the sounds stopped, there was only the understanding of what the silence meant and the question of whether anyone was coming. Lifeboat 14, under 5th Officer Lowe, transferred its passengers to other boats and went back toward where the ship had sunk and recovered 4 living people from among the debris. The officer in charge of lifeboat number 1 had 12 people in a boat with a capacity of 40 and did not go back. These differences in the decisions made by the people in the boats are not simply historical facts. They are the kinds of decisions that reveal character in the starkest possible way and that have been discussed and argued about by everyone who has ever thought seriously about what the Titanic's story means. The ocean floor where the Titanic rests and what it looks like now. The Titanic lies in two main sections on the floor of the North Atlantic, approximately 3,800 meters below the surface. The bow section is largely intact and has settled upright into the sediment, with its anchor chains still hanging and its bow still pointing forward, as if the ship is still moving through the water, when in fact it has been stationary for over a century. The stern section, which broke away from the bow as the ship sank, is more severely damaged, having been subject to greater structural stresses during the sinking and having imploded as it descended under the increasing water pressure of the deep ocean. Between the two main sections lies a debris field stretching for approximately 1 mile, in which the contents of the ship, ejected during the sinking and the descent, lie scattered across the ocean floor. The iron-eating bacteria that live in the deep ocean have been consuming the ship's steel since it sank, and the rate of deterioration has accelerated significantly since the wreck's discovery and the subsequent visits of submersible scientists who have studied the wreck over the past 4 decades believe that within the next 20 to 50 years, the Titanic will have deteriorated to the point where the major structures of the ship are no longer recognizable. The bacteria will eat the iron. The currents will redistribute the debris. The cold and the pressure and the passage of time will complete what the iceberg began. In the darkness, 3,800 meters below the surface of the North Atlantic, the greatest ship in the world is slowly returning to the elements from which it was made. The steel that was smelted in the furnaces of the Industrial Revolution and shaped by the hands of the workers of Belfast is being unmade by biology and chemistry and time in a process that will outlast the last person who ever heard the Titanic's story and will continue in the dark long after human memory has released it entirely. The sea is patient. The sea keeps its own counsel, and in the end, as in the beginning, the sea wins. The food on the Titanic and what the last meal was like across the 3 classes. The menus that survive from the Titanic's final day tell the story of class as clearly as any other single document. The first class dinner served on the evening of April the 14th, 1912, ran to 11 courses and included dishes of a quality and elaboration that most of the passengers eating them had never encountered at sea. Oysters canapés were followed by consommé olga and cream of barley soup, then salmon with mousseline sauce and cucumbers, then filet mignons lili and sauté of chicken lyonnaise, vegetable marrow farci, lamb with mint sauce, roast duckling with applesauce, sirloin of beef with chateau potatoes, green pea and creamed carrots and boiled rice, parmentier and boiled new potatoes, then punch romaine to cleanse the palate, then roast squab and cress, then cold asparagus vinaigrette, then pâté de foie gras and celery, then Waldorf pudding and peaches in chartreuse jelly, then chocolate and vanilla eclairs and French ice cream. The wines that accompanied this meal included Heidsieck Monopole champagne, Graves wine, Haut-Brion claret, and Mout and Chandon. The coffee was served in the reception room where the orchestra played until the men retired to the smoking room. On the same ship, on the same evening, in the 3rd-class dining room several decks below, passengers ate from a menu that included rice soup, roast pork with sage and pearl onions, cabin biscuits and fresh bread, boiled potatoes, and plum pudding with sweet sauce. It was not a bad meal. By the standards of what many of these passengers ate at home, it was probably a good one. But the distance between the 11-course first-class dinner and the 3rd-class supper was not simply a distance of cuisine. It was a distance of possibility, of expectation, of the entire social world that each group of passengers inhabited and would return to if they survived. The menus of the Titanic's last night are among the most eloquent documents of the Edwardian class system that have ever been printed on paper. The speed at which the news spread and how the world learned what had happened. The news of the Titanic disaster spread around the world in a way that had never been possible before. Because of the same wireless technology that had proved so consequential on the night of the sinking itself. The first confused reports reached New York in the early hours of April the 15th and were immediately transmitted by the wire services to newspapers across North America and Europe. The early reports were wildly inaccurate. Several newspapers reported that the Titanic was being towed to port and that all passengers had been saved. The White Star Line's offices in New York and London issued statements that were misleading, either because the information they had was genuinely unclear, or because they were trying to manage the news in a way that served their interests. The confusion lasted for days, as the wireless traffic from the Carpathia, overloaded with the task of transmitting the survivor list and with the commercial demands of the press, was slow and fragmentary, and sometimes contradictory. Crowds gathered outside the White Star Line offices in New York and in Southampton, waiting for the lists of survivors and the lists of the dead that would tell families whether the person they were waiting for was among those who had been saved. The experience of those days, the wait between knowing that the ship had sunk and knowing whether your person had survived, was an agony without precedent in the history of maritime disasters, because the wireless technology that connected the rescue ship to the shore gave families the knowledge that a rescue was underway, without giving them the knowledge of whether their particular person was rescued. Information and uncertainty coexisted in a combination that was more painful than either ignorance or full knowledge would have been. In this too, the Titanic was a preview of the modern world. The experience of waiting for information that is coming, but has not yet arrived, is one that the wireless age created, and that every subsequent communications technology has repeated and amplified. What it felt like to be the last person rescued and the last person to survive. Milfina Dean was 2 months old when the Titanic sank, and 97 years old when she died in 2009, the last surviving passenger of the disaster. She had no memory of the night itself, having been an infant, and her connection to the event was entirely mediated through the accounts of others, and through the fact of her own survival and her father's death. She was born Elizabeth Milvina Dean in February 1912, and she was on the Titanic because her father Frederick had accepted a job offer in Kansas and had booked the family's passage as third-class passengers. Her mother Georgette survived with Milvina and her brother Bertram. Frederick did not survive. The family returned to England, and Milvina grew up without a father in the ordinary way of many families of her generation, without knowing for many years that her particular fatherlessness had a famous cause. She did not learn that she had been on the Titanic until she was 8 years old. She did not become publicly known as a Titanic survivor until the discovery of the wreck in 1985 brought renewed public interest in the story and began to seek out the dwindling number of people still alive who had been on the ship. From that point until her death, she became the most famous of the last survivors, attending exhibitions and commemorations and speaking with researchers and enthusiasts who wanted to connect the living reality of a person to the historical event that had shaped her life so fundamentally before she was old enough to form a memory of it. She died on the 31st of May 2009, 98 years to the day after the Titanic was launched. With her death, the last living link between the world of April 1912 and the world of the present, was severed. The Titanic passed entirely into history. No one living now has a direct personal memory of the ship. The story is now entirely in the hands of those who were not there, which is where all history eventually ends up, and where the responsibility to tell it accurately and honestly becomes, if anything, more important than it was before. The Titanic's speed on the night of the collision, and why it was not reduced. One of the most persistently debated questions about the Titanic disaster is why the ship did not slow down when ice had been reported in the waters ahead. The answer involves a combination of factors that together illuminate the assumptions and the culture of the Edwardian maritime world in ways that feel both alien and uncomfortably familiar. The first factor was the established practice of the North Atlantic run. Speed was commercially important. Passengers and mail and cargo paid for delivery, and the schedules that ships operated to were set by commercial agreements that penalized delays. The practice of reducing speed in response to ice warnings was not standard and not required by any regulation. The standard practice was to post extra lookouts and proceed. Captain Smith and his officers were following the established norms of their profession in continuing at speed. The second factor was the visibility conditions that night. The sea was exceptionally calm and the air exceptionally clear, and the prevailing belief, supported by years of experience on the North Atlantic, was that icebergs in such conditions would be spotted in time. That belief was wrong. The absence of moon and swell and waves removed the visual cues that would normally have helped, and the iceberg was not spotted until it was too late. The third factor was the pressure, real or perceived, to make a good showing on the maiden voyage. The inquiry testimony about whether J. Bruce Ismay encouraged Captain Smith to maintain speed in order to arrive in New York early and generate positive press coverage is contradictory and has never been definitively resolved. Ismay denied having done so. Some witnesses suggested otherwise. The truth is probably that the pressure was more cultural than explicit. The general atmosphere of a maiden voyage in which everyone wanted things to go well, and in which slowing down for ice warnings that might prove to have been unnecessary felt like an unnecessary caution in a profession that valued confident seamanship. These factors together created the conditions in which 1,500 people died. None of them were the result of malice. All of them were the result of assumption. The assumption that the ship was safe. The assumption that the lookouts would see the ice. The assumption that the world was as manageable as the confidence of the era suggested it was. These are the assumptions that the Titanic story exists to question. And they are the reason why, a century later, we are still thinking about them. The survivors who testified and the stories that survived them. The testimony given at the American and British inquiries by the survivors of the Titanic constitutes one of the richest collections of eyewitness accounts of any single disaster in the history of maritime investigation. 705 people survived the sinking. Of those, a considerable number gave formal testimony or provided written statements that became part of the historical record. Others wrote memoirs or gave interviews that added detail and perspective to the official accounts. The result is a body of evidence about what happened on the Titanic that is extraordinarily rich and sometimes extraordinarily contradictory. Survivors who were in adjacent lifeboats gave accounts of the same events that differed in significant details. Survivors who watched the sinking from the water described it differently from those who watched it from the boats. The question of whether the ship broke in two before sinking was disputed by survivors, until the discovery of the wreck confirmed that it had. The question of what the band played in its final minutes has never been definitively resolved, because the survivors who were close enough to hear remember different pieces. These contradictions are not evidence of dishonesty. They are evidence of the nature of traumatic memory. People who have experienced something terrible do not always remember it accurately or consistently. Not because they are lying, but because the brain under extreme stress records experience differently from the brain in ordinary circumstances. The Titanic testimonies are therefore both the most valuable evidence we have and evidence that requires careful handling and triangulation against other sources before any conclusion is drawn. The historians and researchers who have spent careers studying these accounts have done the world a service, not simply because they have preserved the record, but because they have modeled the kind of careful attention to evidence that all historical catastrophe deserves.